Dr. Stephen Pierce, he has a big background in East African history, especially with ideas of charity and Zanzibar, the Swahili coast. So he's very, very prepared for these kinds of topics. So we're excited to have him here, and hopefully everyone enjoys it.
I'm probably going to stick close to the podium, and that's because I'm going to stick close to my notes for precisely the reason that Colin pointed out that my day job is as a historian of Africa, East Africa specifically. So eclipses, I mean, historians care about these sorts of things and how people have thought about eclipses over time, but I wouldn't say it's something that I look at every single day. And so I've tried to write some things down so that we don't go for 2 and 3 and 4 hours, which is possible anytime you start talking about something as global as eclipses. But I want to thank Colin for inviting me to do this. My first sort of inclination, my first response was absolutely not. I'm not going to give a talk that's about eclipses. And then thought about it a little bit more and said, yeah, that would be fun. I think it's cool. It's fun. Like Colin said, I teach at Indiana Wesleyan University. I've been there for about 8-9 years. And again, teaching African history, world culture. It's kind of that global connection that's really something that drives me on. And so you'll see that, I think, in the next couple of minutes. But I'm also going to stick close to the podium so that I'm close to the microphone. I'm not one of those people who says my voice carries and I can just sort of overwhelm a room. So if I'm not loud enough, you say, hey, please make it louder. But really what I want to do today is to just kind of talk a little bit about a couple of stories about eclipses and see where that might lead us. And I want to start by saying a brief clarification. My talk is not going to be about Pink Floyd. I sort of threw that idea past Colin. He said, yeah, that sounds cool. And I didn't really get any further with it than that. But if you were coming expecting to hear a talk about Pink Floyd, that will not be in any way a component of what we talk about today. So, feel free to get some cookies and figure it out. No, I want to talk about a couple of stories about eclipses. And I think they're pretty meaningful. I want to start with one that maybe you have heard of before. Imagine that you're a Midwesterner in the year 1806, just a decade before Indiana is admitted as the 19th state in the Union. Situation in the Midwest is pretty tense at the time. Napoleon had just sold Jefferson the Louisiana Purchase just a couple of years before, and just a few years before that, a young Army officer, a 28-year-old Army officer named William Henry Harrison, has been nominated as the governor of the Indiana Territory. William Henry Harrison, who will later go on to Tippecanoe fame.
And presidency fame.
And presidency fame, yes, thank you for that clarification. Lewis and Clark had just reached the Pacific Ocean, and they've turned around and they've started back on their return journey. And at the same time, white settlers are pouring into the Northwest Territories as a result of the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. Over the next decade, the population of Ohio is going to go up. The white population of Ohio is going to go up by 5 tons. In the mind of Governor Harrison, there's one fly in the ointment of this expansion story, and that's a guy that you're probably familiar with, a Shawnee chief who recognized what the expansion meant for his people and was working to build a confederation of Native American tribes that would push back against further territorial losses. His name was Tecumseh. Tecumseh's cause in this was aided by his younger brother, whose name I'm likely to butcher, Tenskwatawa, who was simply known as the Prophet. Tenskwatawa has an interesting story all of his own, but he's respected as a charismatic kind of prophetic leader, and is helping to bring sort of a spiritual dimension to the pushback against westward expansion. Well, Governor Harrison is having none of this. None of this whole, the prophet's going to put, is going to create problems with the treaty system and all of that kind of stuff. And so on April 12, 1806, Governor Harrison writes to Tecumseh this letter. He says, "Who is this pretended prophet who dares to speak in the name of the great Creator? Examine him. Demand of him some proofs, at least, of him being the messenger of the deity. If he really is a prophet, ask him to cause the sun to stand still, the moon to alter its course, the rivers to cease to flow, or the dead to rise from the graves." And I'm sure that Harrison is thinking to himself, ha 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 ha, I got you. If you're going to call yourself a prophet, show me the power that's there. If he does these things, then you may then believe that he has been sent by God. And I imagine that probably Tecumseh spewed out his coffee a little bit when he's being read this letter, because he's laughing all the way to the bank. He realizes for some reason, he apparently knew that a total eclipse of the sun was predicted for June 16th, 1806, just a few months after that. So Tecumseh responds in a letter to William Henry Harrison with these words: 50 days from this day, when the sun has reached its highest point, at that moment will the Great Spirit take into her hand and hide it from us. And the darkness of night will thereupon cover us, and the stars will shine round about us. The birds will roost, and the night creatures will awaken and stir. And wouldn't you know it, at 11 o'clock on June 16th, and again, I imagine Tenskwatawa gathers a great ceremony for this to happen to great fanfare. The face of the sun is covered by the moon. Ohio is in the path of totality. And he performs the ceremony, then the prophet performs the ceremony to bring the sun back into the sky and to rescue the people of Ohio and Indiana from the darkness that will ensue. And reports say that when he performed that ceremony, it was to the astonishment not only of Tecumseh's own followers, not only did it confirm all the things that Tecumseh was saying about his relationship with white people, but it actually was to the astonishment of many of Ohio's settlers. We don't actually know how Tecumseh knew there was going to be an eclipse. Probably the best possibility is that he had run across an almanac. There were a whole bunch of eclipse chasers in 1806 who were all there in Ohio to see the eclipse. We don't know how he knew that. But William Henry Harrison must have had a lot of egg on his face. Now, there's more than one irony to this story. There's the inversion of Tecumseh using science against European settlers. That would not be the first time or the last time when science would be used in the cause of a political end. And there's the irony that an unconvinced William Henry Harrison would just not too many years later go to war with Tecumseh in 1811 to 1813. But there's a kind of glaring disjuncture in the story that I want to sort of spend some time with here. You see that this particular story is interesting precisely because it's clear that Tecumseh understood what an eclipse was. In fact, he most likely had obtained the information in his travels in white society. On a side note, I will not be explaining what an eclipse is because I am not a scientist. So we have scientists in the room, and there was a talk last week about the science of the eclipse. If you want to know more about the science of the eclipse, I'll point you in the right direction. I'm not going to be explaining that, but Tecumseh knew what an eclipse was, scientifically. But he interpreted the meaning of the eclipse as a sign from the Great Spirit. I don't think that was a cynical move. You see, people just like us have been obsessed with the heavens for as long as we could see the heavens and had the leisure to look out at the heavens and spend time wondering what it means. As early as 585 BCE, the Greek philosopher Thales seems to have been able to predict an eclipse that would take place in a particular place in a particular year. Almost 2,000 years before that, the builders of Stonehenge had calculated the rising and the setting of the sun to such precision that they could build a stone monument in one place to track where it was going to be at any particular moment. And in the 5th century BCE, Pericles is supposed to have explained to his troops exactly how an eclipse occurs. But no matter how much we know how eclipses happen, we are also fascinated by the beauty and the strangeness of it, right? Think about this. Why will thousands of people flock to central Indiana, clogging traffic and terrorizing businesses, just to see the moon pass in front of the sun? Why is it that one astronomer, Frank Orrell, who viewed dozens of eclipses, was still so moved in 1966 that he wrote in his journal, "The heavens declare the glory of God"? He later wrote, that's not something I normally cite in my journals, right? This is his scientific journals. Perhaps it has something to do with the fact that an eclipse is just so unlikely. What's the likelihood that even though the sun is 400 times the size of the moon, that because of its distance from the Earth, it appears in the sky almost exactly the same size as the moon? Isn't it impressive that with the variations of the distance of the moon from the sun and the Earth, that it, at any single location on the Earth, can only expect a total eclipse of the sun about every 375 years? Obviously, that's more than my lifetime. It is a once-in-a-lifetime event, one so stunning, so dangerous, and so powerful, and above all, so coincidental, that it evokes an experience that begs for an explanation. There must be something more to it. Science does a great job of explaining how things happen, and science is incredible, right? But we still tend to want to know an explanation for why eclipses happen. I like a story that an anthropologist, E. Evans Pritchard, told many years ago. He's not an anthropologist of eclipses. He's an anthropologist who worked in northeastern Africa in the Sudan. And he lived with a group of people called the Azandi. The Azandi he lived with, he said, often explained events using the concept of witchcraft. On a few occasions, elevated wooden storage bins of grain would collapse due to the natural activities of termites who would eat out the supports of the grain bins. And people would often sit under the grain bins, relaxing in the shade of the grain bins, and had been known to be severely wounded when these grain bins would collapse. When the claims of witchcraft were brought up, E. Evans Pritchard would ask people why they couldn't just see that it was the termites eating out the supports of the grain bins, and that was the cause of the collapse, not witchcraft. They would respond, yes, obviously, the termites ate the supports to the grain bins. But why did they choose that particular moment to eat out the supports to the grain bins? In essence, yes, obviously the termites are the cause of the collapse. But who sent the termites? And why at that particular moment? And if you figure that out, then you'll figure out what kinds of goods and evils existed in the world. As in E. Evans Pritchard's story, humans have tried to explain eclipses in all kinds of ways. While Egyptian legends changed over time, they had a particularly evocative view of how the world functioned. And I'm going to have to defer a little bit here. Colin knows a great deal more about Egyptians than I do, so he may have to correct me here on some of my facts. But they said in the beginning of the world, and this is a diagram that's not from Egypt itself. This is a diagram that someone has put together since then, but showing the 9 gods of the sort of big Egyptian pantheon. So while Egyptian legends change over time, they had a particularly evocative view of how the world functioned. In the beginning, the world was chaos, and out of that chaos was first born the sun god Ra, or Amun or Atu, who continued to be the most important god in their pantheon. Ra then gave birth to 8 other deities, among which were day and night, earth and air, Osiris, Isis, and Set. And you'll see some of those deities on there. The Osiris, Isis, Set, Horus mythological cycle is kind of at the center of this. And so obsessed with the balance of all those different forces, they believed that when the sun rose each morning and set each night in this pathway of this boat going through the sky, that it represented a mythic journey from youth to middle age, to old age, to eventual death. Every single day, Ra was often represented as being in a boat with a whole bunch of attendants, or alternately, as a ball in the sky that's getting rolled through the sky, kind of the way a dung beetle rolls a ball through the sand in Egypt. And so this is part of the reason why Egyptians venerated the scarabs. If you've ever seen the mummy, you kind of a sense of the scarab in Egyptian mythology and its popular representation in our culture. So they saw this as kind of a life and death mythological cycle. All that kind of sounds a little strange to 21st century ears, but try to put yourself in the place of an Egyptian or a Babylonian or a Persian or a Greek or even an ancient Roman. Our lives are governed by alarm clocks and electricity and patterns of work schedules, rather than the natural rhythms of sun and dark, rainy or dry seasons, sowing or harvesting. For all of the emerging civilizations since the third millennium BCE onward, the relationship with the sun and the moon and the Nile and the river and the rain, all of those things were absolutely life and death. They were the most important things in their universe. And so you can understand why they would be obsessed with what happens if the sun doesn't come up or what happens if the sun is obscured, right? They understood that if the rains didn't come or the sun didn't shine, the margins that they had for survival were absolutely razor thin. And so as a result, the sun and the moon both played an important role in the Osiris-Isis cycle that lay at the heart of this birth, death, and rebirth narrative. If you've never read what the Osiris-Isis thing is, you should look it up. It's really, really, really fascinating. The story goes something like this. Ra gave birth to two pairs of gods, Osiris and his consort Isis, his wife Isis. Osiris was the god of agriculture and rebirth. Obviously, the corn dies, it goes into the ground, and it's reborn somehow. Osiris is the god of agriculture, rebirth, the afterlife. And then the counterpart to that is Set and his consort Nephthys. And the Osiris cycle is complicated and has everything you could want from a good story. Osiris gets murdered by his brother/enemy Set out of jealousy or maybe an unforgiven wrong. Isis then journeys through the earth looking for either the soul or body of Osiris or maybe the 26 parts of Osiris that are scattered across, depends on which legend you're looking at, in order to resurrect him. Along the way, she's aided by several gods, one of whom is Thoth, the god of the moon, and she also gives birth to her son Horus, the falcon god. Now, for Egyptians, the soaring flight of the falcon, I just was driving on 300 yesterday and saw a turkey buzzard flying over the fields. I was pretty impressed by how it was just sort of hanging in the wind there. The soaring flight of the falcon reminded them of the flight of the heavenly bodies through the sky. And so some of them represented the falcon's two eyes as the sun and the moon. And in one curious myth, the lunar phases and eclipses were explained by the enmity between Seth and Horus. And I've reproduced some of this. It's a lot to read, but let me read it for you. Between Horus and Set, there is enmity and hatred. Set is cunning and crafty, and he seeks to conquer by subtlety rather than by courage and skill at the fray, but the power of Horus is not the same. For whoever gazes into the blue eyes of Horus can see the future reflected there, and both gods and men seek Horus to learn what shall come to pass. It came to the knowledge of Set that Ra would consult with Horus, and it seemed to him that an opportunity was at hand to injure Horus, so that he took upon himself the form of a black pig. And when Ra came to Horus, saying, let me look in thine eyes, and behold what is to come, the black pig passed by, and Ra knew not that it was the evil god, and then Set aimed a blow of fire at the eye of Horus, and Horus shouted aloud with the pain of the fire, and raged furiously, and cried, it is Set, and he has smitten me with the fire of his eyes. But Set was no longer there, for he had conveyed himself away, and the black pig was seen no more, and Ra cursed the pig because of Set, and said, let the pig be an abomination to Horus. And to this day, men sacrifice the pig when the moon is at the full, because Set The enemy of Horus and the murderer of Osiris took its form in order to injure the blue-eyed god. And there's a lot there. I want to unpack all of what's there. But the idea is that the phases of the moon are really the burning out of Horus's eye, and then Thoth, the god of the moon, beginning to reheal it, and so it becomes full, and then goes into its phases, etc., etc. So what does any of this have to do with eclipses? Two things. First, you can imagine in the mind of Egyptians, the night sky is a pretty scary thing. I still get a little freaked out without a nightlight, if I'm totally honest with you. When I first moved to Wisconsin many years ago, I had never been in such a dark place in my life, and you can imagine, most of us in Indiana can imagine what that's like. I grew up in New Jersey. There is no place in New Jersey that doesn't have light all the time. And it's been well documented that eclipses can freak out even the most hardy of onlookers. As you watch the eclipse, also watch those who are around you, and watch the birds and the animals and the plants, all of whom are going to respond to the eclipse in interesting ways. For the Egyptians, it was dangerous. Ra had to travel quite literally through the realm of the dead, under the world, to reemerge in the east, to travel his course once more. And all along the way, Ra is pursued by a serpent trying to waylay him. You can see the serpent of chaos. Thoth, the moon, was alternately one of Horus's eyes that had been damaged by Set, and also one of the gods who aids Ra in his constant cycle of emerging again in the morning. And that seems to be the explanation of eclipses. Not so much that the moon is attacked by that the sun is attacked by the moon, but that the sun is attacked by this great serpent in the sky that goes on to eat the sun. That's a belief that's really common among ancient people. In Norse mythology, Loki, the trickster god, out of spite created two great wolves, Skull and Monogarmer. Skull and Monogarmer pursue the sun and the moon through the sky relentlessly. When Skull eats the sun, we experience an eclipse, and obviously when Monogarmer eats the moon, we experience a lunar eclipse. Ancient Chinese people believe that either alternately a giant dragon or a giant dog ate the sun, and therefore that was the cause of an eclipse. And Hindu society believed that the demon Rahu, after being cut in half by the god Narayana, eats the sun out of revenge for his persecution by the gods. Other cultures believe that eclipses were caused either by conflict between the gods or by love between the gods, between the sun and the moon. One of my favorite stories is that told in Germanic mythology. And I don't think I have a picture of this, but in Germanic mythology, the story is told of the cool male moon god marrying the hot female sun goddess. But as one might expect, the moon had trouble keeping up with the passion of the fiery sun god. And so he wanted to go to sleep. And soon, you might imagine, she became quite frustrated with him. So they made a bet. Sun and the moon made a bet. The sun agreed to go to bed with the moon. And they decided that whoever woke up first would get to rule over the dead. Now you can imagine that the moon falls asleep and stays fast asleep, as all of us men will have a tendency to do on a Sunday afternoon. And as the moon slept, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the sun woke up, and so she has ruled over the day ever since. And in this particular mythological cycle, because it's so frustrating for them to be together, the sun rules over the day and the moon rules over the night, but they're inexorably drawn together to one another. And so every so often, actually in a very predictable way, every so often the sun is drawn to the moon and they come together in their marriage, but they quickly set to fighting again, so that they have to separate. They go through this constant cycle of coming together and being apart. Yeah, that sounds about right. It sounds like marriage. The ancient Maya believed that eclipses were caused when the sun god was attacked by his brother and rival Chak-ek, which we know as the planet Venus. Since Venus can sometimes be seen in the sky close to the sun during an eclipse, the Maya believed that it was he who was responsible for the attack. It was important then for the Maya and for later Aztecs priests to mitigate the danger of the attack by sacrificing sacred snakes, representing either Kukulkan in Maya mythology or Quetzalcoatl in Aztec mythology during the eclipse to make it stop. And that's kind of an important point. Many ancient people saw eclipses as really dangerous, right? The sun has gone away. How do we bring it back? And sought to prevent those eclipses from happening. As late as the 17th century, observers watched as Hindus all across India plunged themselves neck deep in the water of the Ganges, hoping by that to purify themselves, and then also to aid the sun and the moon to fight off the demon dragon. We talked about Rahu, right? To fight off the demon dragon that was trying to eat them. Europeans were frequently implored by priests all the way up to the 19th century and even beyond, by priests to stay indoors during the eclipse. Because the air they perceived could cause horrible diseases, or probably the most common thing which we'll read about eclipses, because that will make women unable to conceive if they've been outside during the eclipse. According to some of the oldest Chinese texts, a pair of brothers, Shi and Ho, were court astronomers charged with predicting and also preventing eclipses as far back as 2000 BCE, supposedly. During one eclipse event, they got so drunk and fell asleep and missed the eclipse and were therefore unceremoniously executed as a result. There's all kinds of Shi and Ho, or is it kind of interesting? There's other interesting myths about that. Some Native American tribes performed war dances or worked furiously in the fields, trying to fend off the anger of the sun and the moon god during an eclipse. And the Chippewa even took up their bows and arrows and shot flaming arrows in the sky to try to rekindle the sun. The sun has gone out. The sun dropped his torch, and now it's gone out. We need to rekindle it. And I want to pause here to observe something about these beliefs. Because I think to us, many of us in the 21st century, these belief systems may seem like superstitious, right? And it seems weird to us that cultures tended to think that these eclipses portended something, that they meant something. But it's important to remember that as the author of this particular book, it's kind of an old book, but it has an interesting claim that it's making. As the authors of this book say, the fundamental difference between the attitudes of modern and ancient man as regards the surrounding world is this. For modern scientific man, the phenomenal world is primarily an it, right? This is an it. It's an inanimate object. But for the ancient and also for the primitive man, it is a thou, it's a person. Our view of causality then would not satisfy primitive man because of the impersonal character of its explanations. We may explain that certain physiological processes cause a man's death. He would be right. Primitive man asks, why should this man die thus at this moment? He wants to find a cause as specific and individual as the event, which it must explain. The event is not analyzed intellectually, it's experienced in its complexity and individuality. And these are matched by equally individual causes. Death is willed. And I think what we see is that sounds familiar, right? It sounds like E.E. Evans Pritchard's observations that he's making in the 1950s among the Izandi. And it reminds us that at least some ancient people understood what was happening scientifically and simply thought there were more profound answers to the questions that they were asking. So how much did they actually know? As early as the 3rd millennium BCE, humans were already building monuments of incredible precision to the observation of the heavenly bodies. And this is maybe one of the most famous ones. We've observed the Chinese texts about Shi and Ho, which some scholars have tried to locate at around 2000 BCE. And while Stonehenge doesn't really tell us whether the inhabitants of Britain could predict or understand eclipses particularly, the monument is so accurately aligned to so many of the heavenly movements that it would not be hard to imagine that they understood what an eclipse was and when it was going to happen and how it was going to happen. if you see the picture of Stonehenge, the primary alignment is from this center of the circle through these two stones called the heel stones. And if you're standing at this particular place on the sunrise of the summer solstice, and you watch the sun come up, this is a picture so took from that particular space, the sun comes up right between those two heel stones, and you see it depicted in that side. The power of that experience is similar, right? The summer solstice. This is the beginning of the moment when we can begin to farm and harvest, and all of life begins again. But the original four stones of the monument were actually oriented toward this one toward the summer solstice, but then the sunset in the winter solstice, and then the orientations of the moon and the gigs. So Stonehenge is an enormously fascinating kind of place. The first mathematical models we have come from the Babylonians, who by the 3rd century BCE were keeping meticulous astronomical records. And were able to identify something called the Saros, the sort of cycle of the number of days between, again, I'm getting into science talk, I'm very much in a realm that I'm comfortable in, but they were able to identify that a Saros was about every 6,585 days, or 18 years and 11 days. And that's the amount of time between one eclipse and another eclipse, very much of the same. The cycle for the lunar and solar eclipses are slightly different. And the Babylonians had observed all of that. On the other side of the planet, Maya astronomers noticed a pattern in which a certain number of eclipse half years, or about 177 days, there was going to be, after that cycle, there was going to be the danger of another eclipse. Again, this is a dangerous moment. And so in this one particular codex called the Dresden Codex, we see a number of numerical symbols. We see a number of numerical symbols, and juxtaposed to those numerical symbols, 177, 177, 177, 148. We've worked that out with precision. Then we see the symbol for an eclipse, and just under the symbol for the eclipse, I know that that's really light, but if you can see that serpent coming up to eat the sun, right? So yes, it's mythological, but it's also scientific in a way, right? It's about observed events. The first actual predictions of eclipses are certainly by the Greeks. The 6th century Greek philosopher Thales, we've already said, is supposed to have accurately predicted an eclipse. But at least by the time of Pericles, who's in the Greek Golden Age of the 5th century, the Greeks were beginning to form theories about the physical causation of eclipses. In one story, when Pericles' army was terrified by an occurrence of an eclipse, he is supposed to have said, he holds his cloak up in front of one of his men's eyes and asks the soldier whether something sort of magical or terrible has happened. And the soldier says, no, obviously nothing terrible or magical has happened. And Pericles says, well, then what's supposedly magical about the moon coming in front of the face of the sun? And he's trying to say to his armies, you can go ahead and fight this battle. There's tons of stories like that in Greek mythology, including ones about the Persian king Xerxes interpreting a particular eclipse as a sign that he should go and fight the Greeks. And he goes and he's defeated by the Greeks, and the Greeks say, no, this is actually our God who's fighting for us. A little bit later on, during the Hellenistic period, which is about the 1st to 2nd century BCE, the Hellenistic Greeks built a machine called the Eclipse to predict the cycle of the eclipses. If this is mathematically precise, then certainly they could build a machine to predict it. Now, you may have seen The Dial of Destiny, which just came out a couple years ago, if you like Indiana Jones movies. Indiana Jones movies portray the Eclipse as somehow predicting like wormholes or something like that. And that's pretty clearly not true. But it's pretty amazing that by the time of Archimedes, they are actually able to predict some of the happening movements. In these stories, we begin to see the emergence of a long tradition of physical explanations for eclipses sitting side by side comfortably with mythological ones. During the supposedly dark ages, medieval scholars clearly understood what caused an eclipse. The Visigothic priest Isidore of Seville once famously said this, and I find this really evocative. He says the moon is nearer to the Earth than the sun is when it's due to its shorter orbit. It completes the course more quickly. For the journey that the sun completes in 365 days, the moon runs through in 30 days. The eclipse of the sun occurs whenever the moon on the 30th lunar day comes to that line where the sun travels, and by interposing itself before the sun conceals it, right? Isidore of Seville understood clearly what was happening with this eclipse. Now, as a result of theories of Ptolemy and Aristotle, they were still thinking about the cosmos in quite different ways. They're thinking about a cosmos as being a physical, like eggshell or spheres that operate in different kinds of ways. We can talk about it in the Q&A if you'd like to, but he understood what was going on. And yet, at the same time, just a few centuries later, in fact, in the 11th century, Crusaders who invaded the Holy Land interpreted blood moons and lunar eclipses as favorable to the Crusaders and solar eclipses as favorable to the Muslim armies. So while it would take till the 19th century for scientists to move past Aristotle and Ptolemy's models of the universe and understand the physics of eclipses, we need to be honest about the amount that ancient and medieval people actually knew during the Middle Ages, which is quite a lot, actually, kind of fascinating quite a lot. Okay, well, I have clearly run out of time, but if I could kind of tie a bow around this, if there's a lesson for me from all the reading and fascinating stuff that I've read, and man, once you start cracking open and start reading about eclipses, then you see the stuff everywhere. That's been enlightening. I'd like to return to an observation that we made earlier about the way ancient peoples thought about science, the sun, and the stars. Because while we've learned a great deal from the science about what causes eclipses to occur, about the it of eclipses, if you will, rather than the thou of eclipses, I think what early society teaches us, if we listen carefully, is that they saw the sun, the moon, and the stars as co-travelers in the universe with human beings. They sought to understand, and yes, even to exploit. There's lots of stories where politicians are using eclipses to say, this is why we should go to battle. They sought to understand, and yes, even exploit, but they also sought to respect, even to the point of worship. I get that might be a little bit much. And whether you believe that the sun is a deity in the sky, or was made by the great God of the universe, or is simply a sphere of hydrogen gas being consumed into helium gas, that's as far as I'm going to take that physics, exhibiting that level of respect and humility just might go a long way to someplace that we want to get in the 21st century. So, enjoy the eclipse and wear eye protection. I doubt to myself that I will tell you wear eye protection. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Pierce. And we got some time for a few questions for a few minutes.
Yes.
In ancient times, they didn't have those glasses. Did hundreds and thousands of people go blind?
They could go inside, right? I mean, for example, if you refer to the Navajo, a lot of people were Navajo. When the eclipse happens, go inside traditionally and see that as a time of prayer and renewal, right? And that you have people today saying, well, clearly the people who started this tradition in long before in history must have been aware that, hey, you probably should not be staring directly into the sun for long periods of time during this period, but this is sort of as a liminal space of renewal of the sun and the moon in relationship to each other. I'm sorry.
No, you're absolutely right. Some societies would say you need to get out of the realm. You need not be looking at it at all, right? So that's certainly one approach. By the time of Plato, so by at least the 4th century BCE, we have written records of Plato saying the way to observe an eclipse is not to look at it, but to look at its reflection in water, right? And then you have the pinhole method, use a pinhole to allow it to be reflected on something else. So, it seems clear that ancient peoples recognized don't look at the sun. And I think as I'm doing the research, I kept thinking, I think it's part of the danger. You can imagine that it wouldn't take long for stories about people looking at the sun, even though it looked dark, and being blinded by it. It wouldn't take long for people to find that to be a terrifyingly powerful experience, and not to do that. Yeah, it's a good question. But I think, and there may be actually other methods to observing an eclipse without the use of protective glasses, but the pinhole method and the reflection method are two of the most clear. Bill.
There's a great Stonehenge site in Ireland, Newgrange, in the Boyne Valley, and it's a completely colored structure. It looks just like a hill, which it was for a long time. But there, you enter in there, and when the sun is in the right position, it's reflected. You go through this tunnel, and the sun is reflected in the back of the tunnel against the wall, in effect making it a camera.
Yeah.
And these were fairly common.
I have a question, it's more of a historiographical of one. And I am reminded, for example, the eclipse of King Henry I, where in England this was seen as or later on at least, as an omen for what would become the anarchy, the secession crisis afterward. And my question is, in the time, when does the shift happen, right? From, oh, this eclipse might be a sign of question mark, something, to, okay, now we can attribute this causality to that sort of phenomenon. I'm sorry, that's sort of weird.
No, it's not a weird question. And if I had about another hour, I think we probably would have gotten there eventually. So, and some of the real honest to goodness scientists in the room might be able to, mathematicians who might be able to help me out a little bit more. But when does the transition happen? I think there's two questions there. When does the transition happen when we begin to understand the physical causation of eclipses? And that, for the most part, the science of it doesn't start until the 19th century, into the early 1800s. And that's part of the reason why the Tecumseh story is so interesting, because that's right at the cusp of when people are going to begin to use the eclipse as a way of understanding how the physical makeup and understanding the sun set is happening in the early half of the 19th century. Your other question is, when do we stop wondering, what does this thing mean? And I think probably the answer to that is never. I think we still wonder what it means. But the shift for me is happening, right around that same period of time in the post-Enlightenment age, where we, saying we as collectively as Westerners, if such thing exists, begin to push aside what we see as superstitious ways of thinking about the world, and begin to say science really has the answers to the causation of all kinds of things. And that's happening maybe in the 1700s or 1800s, right? And arguably, maybe not even then. So it's a little bit of a slippery question. Your observation about eclipses being a sign of political transition and danger, again, I didn't mention that, but that's really common across the world. Again, the little story that I told about Xerxes and the Persian Wars are just a hint at that, but those stories are all over the place. My daughter actually learned one of those stories in science class. So, huh? No.
So I think the shift took place with Newton to a large extent. So Newton's book was The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. And what you find in the book is no explanation of why these things happen, just a mathematical description of how they happen. And before that, natural philosophy, which is what they called science, was interested in the purpose of these things. So after Newton, purpose began to be squeezed out. And so even Steven Weinberg in his book, The First 3 Minutes, says the more we learn about nature, the more purposeless it's